Dan, thank you for those wonderful remarks. I'm reminded of the opportunity you have to go to a photo studio and you can dress up in the garb of a Westerner or the cowboy or the gangster and put your face through cutouts. There's a very famous good picture in Frederick Brenner's book of his wonderful photographer, which has a Jewish fair, and there's a cutout of all these ethnic Jews with cardboard, and you can put your face in, and for a minute you can have payas, or you can have a strimel, or you can dress up as an ethnic Jew. So it's that kind of moment. And then you can take it off.
Yeah. Gee, I'd love to thank you. That was a great analysis. It was extremely clear, and it was powerfully rendered. It was really a beautiful... It was a great piece of work, and there isn't a but following that, that line of praise. But I'd like to say, I guess I look at reality a little bit differently. I think from the point of view of the internal dynamics of Reform Judaism, it was right on target. And yet I tend to look at the development of the Jewish community and all communities through a sociological eye. And I like to see what's going on in the broader culture. And what we're experiencing now in American society broadly is a phenomenal resurgence of religion all over the place. Among evangelicals, among Catholics, a total, in effect, phantasmagoria of spirituality movements around the country and so on and so forth. And I see the movement of reform in that direction as part and parcel of that broader American phenomenon that we're experiencing now in this so-called postmodern period. But to be more precise, I think a lot of Americans feel that there, and you don't have to be conservative to look at it this way, that there's a profound moral breakdown in the United States and a breakdown of community. And religion has now positioned itself very successfully, both Christianity and Judaism, as being the answer to the sense of poverty and vacuousness that so many people feel inside. Religion, because religion provides connections. It provides communal connections most of all, but it also provides connections with one's past, with one's tradition, with a higher power, and so on and so forth, with spiritual realities. So I see Reform Judaism and Judaism, the resurgence of Orthodoxy particularly, which is far more dramatic, as being in effect part and parcel of this sense of anomie, of alienation, of emptiness that so many people testify to in American life. And religion answers those questions for people, and they're sociological questions. I think side by side there's a disenchantment with secular values. You have people making $500,000, they climb the ladder of success, knock on the door, open it, and find there's nothing there. And so they're looking for something other, something transcendental, something religious to cling to. This is the testimony of thousands of people. Unfortunately, social justice doesn't enchant anymore. As if justice goes away, injustice goes away. It's not a problem anymore because it's not fashionable, and so on. The melting pot is dead. Black power in the 60s and Stokely Carmichael led the way towards a new ethnicity, as it were, in American life, and you see ethnicity all over the place. It's not organic ethnicity like our grandparents, in effect, struggled with, or not struggled, but experienced with. It's a type of ethnicity that's undergirded by a sense of autonomy, and it's an elective ethnicity resulting in the types of things that you talked about. I agree. Return of spirituality. Enter any bookstore in the United States. Extraordinary. Look at the books on self-help that are spiritually tinged. Look at books on religion, prayer life, inspiration, spirituality. It's a tremendous phenomenon, which I must admit, personally, I'm not totally unsympathetic to. I understand the impulses towards it and so forth, and it's all over the place. So these are just some of the things that I think conduce or factors in the broader culture that, in effect, inform the sensibilities of Jews to return, whether it to be orthodoxy or looking for a more traditionally based reform within that movement. So I'm just wondering if you have how you see that those external pressures relating to some of the internal factors that you so marvelously elucidated for us.
Certainly there is a search for meaning, for values. But I'm not convinced that the people are finding it in the churches and certainly in the synagogues and temples where they may be going to find it. In fact, the problem is that they're not getting any message, any meaningful philosophy. They are not getting values from these institutions. They may be searching, and you have to give people credit. They're willing to support organized religions that are not giving them anything in return. Look, the prisons are and always have been filled with believers. So I'm not persuaded by the activity that is called resurgence that anything meaningful is happening. In fact, I think the problem is just that the synagogues, and probably in very much and for the same reasons, in much the same way and for the same reasons, the churches are failing to give people meaning. It is why people are looking into the bookstores in these vast shelves on spirituality. They're looking for something they're not getting from where they're supposed to get it. And just as a commercial, it seems to me that humanistic Judaism, that other than orthodoxy, and I'm looking at orthodoxy in its pristine sense, other than orthodoxy, humanistic Judaism today is the only form of Judaism that does offer a message, a distinctive message. You don't go to a Reform or conservative, or even a Reconstructionist congregation these days for content. You go for style, for feeling, for atmosphere, for community, but not for content.
Dan, I want to ask you, the Reform establishment is working very hard and struggling very hard to be accepted by the Israeli Orthodox establishment, especially around the question of conversion and others, and they're trying to show off how good Jewish they are. And my question is, if you think that the last resolution which they got, the changes, are influenced by this game between the Reform establishment and the Israeli clergy and the rights for the law of return and etc. Would you say that there is a connection between them? Because in Israel we have a strong impact seeing how they are fighting and saying that 3 million Jews are behind them.
I'm not sure I'm responding to your question directly. My thought is that if the Reform movement or any Jewish movement wants to make an impact in Israel, it should celebrate its secularism, its humanism, and not try to imitate Orthodoxy by proving how, quote, Jewish they are. Because Israelis don't need another version of traditional Judaism.
Not the Israeli establishment. Are you familiar with the law of return?
No, of course.
Okay, they say that their conversion here is not accepted there, and their marriage here and divorce is not accepted there. And they want to show off that they are as good as the Israeli rabbis.
There's no way they will ever be able to do that.
No, I agree with you that there is no way. But my question is if you think that they are influenced by this struggle, having this kind of changes which they have here.
Is the influence of the Israeli problem having an impact
of the
here?
conflict between them and the Israeli establishment influence their decision and
I don't
changes?
think so.
You don't think so?
No.
Jack, and then, okay.
Dan, I want to have a dialogue for a couple of minutes, if we may. And I want to start by saying, I don't dress up as an ethnic Jew. I am an ethnic Jew. And I think that in thinking through why I felt obliged to say that, it comes from a sense that you and I are coming from somewhat different traditions. And I think it's very important for this colloquium to talk about the fact that there are people here from a variety of different Jewish places. What I'm trying to get at, first of all, is that secular Jewishness and humanistic Judaism have a great deal in common. We're much closer to each other than to virtually all Jews outside of those parameters, but still they're not one and the same. And unlike you, if I understand you correctly, and I'm afraid that we've never met before, and all I know about you is what I heard you say today, I'm more comfortable with the former than with the latter. That is to say, I come from a secular Jewish tradition. And the secular Jewish tradition is very much one rooted in a notion of ethnic Jewishness. This is important, I think, important for me at least, in trying to struggle with the kind of questions that we're dealing with, because for me and for the kinds of people I grew up with and for the kinds of people that I continue to feel close to, the truth and nothing but the truth is that the Birmingham Temple would be a very strange place. Nicht dahin and nicht daher. Neither here nor there, really. It's not what we mean by our Jewishness. And let me try once again to explain, because I want to have a dialogue about this. For me, my Jewishness is rooted in a language and a history and a culture, in songs and in literature, in my reading and understanding of the Jewish past and present, not in religious traditions. And I hope it's clear that I mean no offense to anyone, but to me, the notion of secularizing religious traditions, which is the way that I understand the Birmingham Temple, seems more ersatz, if you'll forgive me, more foreign to me than my continued use of Yiddish, which, by the way, I use on a daily basis. That's point one. Point two, which gets into the discussion that Shula was having with Dan a moment ago, about the reform movement in Israel. And in making this comment, I also want to refer back to what Ze'ev said last night, and I'm very sorry that Ze'ev apparently was unable to stay. Because after we had that extremely interesting discussion last night, and I went home and tried to sleep, it occurred to me that one of the things that we were hearing is how very different it is to be a secular Jew in the Israeli context and a secular Jew in the American context. So there's not only differences between humanistic Judaism in America and secular Jewry in America, there's also profound differences between secular Jews in the United States and secular Jews in Israel. I'm going to be very, very brief, so just bear with me. One of the many, many, many ways in which there's differences between the American context and the Israeli context is that in the American context, we grow up with a tradition of liberal values. We grow up with a tradition of tolerance. We grow up with a tradition of respect for others that's particularly strong in the secular camp. You know what? Israel's not a very tolerant place. I don't think so, Shula. I'm an outsider, but I don't think so.
You.
Not very tolerant.
You undermined it.
It's not very tolerant either on the part of secularists or on the part of those who are traditional. And part of what we were hearing last night, which for me was somewhat strange, etwas fremd. You'll forgive me, I really do think in
That
Yiddish.
none of us know.
Bewusst nicht. I really do think in Yiddish rather than in English, so you'll forgive me, okay? For me, what was actually somewhat strange last night was that Ze'ev doesn't have the kind of tolerance that I would have precisely because he grew up in a completely different culture, or for the last 35 years at least has been living in a completely different culture. And so has an anger that I don't have towards Orthodox and religious counterparts in the United States. It doesn't really matter to me so much if Jews in Williamsburg want to do their trip. It matters an awfully great deal to Ze'ev. Well, exactly. So this is what I'm trying to get at by way of your comments, Dan.
Very briefly, you eloquently state, I think, a very important distinction between what I would call the secular and the humanistic portions of this community. But you used the word Yiddish. I don't speak Yiddish.
I'll teach you, don't worry.
I come from an Orthodox background. I would say from an unusually rich Jewish background, but the ethnicity that was involved in that background, I have to say, is over. We are living, and this is not true of Jews alone, in a post-ethnic world, or at least we're in transition toward that world. And I don't think that the ethnicity that I admire about your background is going to survive in the 21st century. Perhaps in Israel, because there is a living Hebrew language that is distinctive to the Jewish people. But in this country, there isn't. And without the language, which is only one element in a vital, living culture and ethnicity, I don't think you can expect it to survive and to support Jewishness.
I agree with you that there's a tremendous difference between the problem of secular Jews in Israel and the problem of secular Jews anywhere else. And it is easy to term intolerance the feeling of frustration of people who depend on each other. And it's very easy to be tolerant when you really don't care what happens there. You live in Manhattan, and what do you care what happens in the Chabad community in Brooklyn? You don't, unless there is a pogrom, and then you do, but if there is no pogrom, you don't. The difference is that I also enjoyed very much the stand-up comedian act that we had yesterday in the evening, but, and I agreed with all the jokes of Zev. I didn't agree with his conclusions, because the hidden message of his conclusions means that we in Israel should not care what happens in the Orthodox community, and we should. The world is by now tolerant to any discrimination of women, like in Afghanistan, for instance. It was not tolerant when it happened to blacks in South Africa. But now, if a whole half of a population is enslaved in the most terrible and cruel way, the world doesn't care. It's their business, it's not ours. The Israeli secular community has to care what happens to women in the Orthodox community in Israel. It's a cruel discrimination from all points of view, and we do have to care. We cannot tell them, have your own state. It's our state, not theirs. And in our state, which is, by the way, tolerant democracy, very tolerant, so tolerant that Shas could grow to these dimensions because of our tolerance, because of the secular tolerance, not because of religious tolerance. The point is that we have an interdependence in Israel. We live in one Jewish ethnic community, and politically, economically, security-wise, we are dependent on each other. And therefore, we do care, and therefore, we cannot be tolerant if religious coercion makes us less free than you are. Now, this is one point. The other point is more academic, but I really want to ask Dan about it. Isn't it curious that the reaction and the reversal in the reform movement goes back not to religion but to halakha? Something similar that happened in other attempts of revolutionize religion in Jewish life, like the Hasidut, for instance, which became again a very extreme halachic movement, like Shabtaut, who tried to get rid completely of halakha and finally disappeared completely. Isn't it a beginning of the disappearance of the reform movement? Because it gave up all its principles that were aimed at reviving a religion and instead became a halachic movement, or is becoming a halachic movement. Doesn't it mean, when we look at it in a historical perspective, that we are actually witnessing the end of a movement and not the revival or the change in a movement? Because what Dr. Schumann spoke about, the needs of spirituality, the will for some kind of spirituality, cannot be answered by halakha. When you spoke about the absurdity of praying to a God in which you do not believe, in which you made yourself, why is kashrut or any other, or talit or kippah, why are they less absurd? They have nothing to do with our life. And it is a mistake to say that they went back to Buber. Buber, who lived in Rehov, in Chovevei Tzion Street in Jerusalem, was invited to lecture in a synagogue there. And when he came to the synagogue and he was seeing that the prayers are still going on, he stayed outside and said, let them stop praying and then I can enter into a religious house. The fact is that they are going back to a meaningless set of prayers, to a meaningless set of halachic rules, meaningless from their point of view. I'm not speaking about my point of view, but meaningless from their point of view as Reformed Jews. Doesn't it mean that they actually finished their way?
They finished their way today or 100 years ago?
Today.
Yes.
Because 100 years ago they tried to do something.
It's finished. You're right. If I've understood you correctly, I agree, yes.
Bring the microphone.
Bring the microphone over, Marcia.
Hi. There's just so many things I want to respond to from both sessions in the morning, but we're toward the end now, so I'll just say, like, I'm really learning a lot here, by the way. These are wonderful presentations, and as one of the people on the panel that's not a social scientist in orientation, I'm really getting a terrific overview of some of the movements I've been working within and alongside and not seeing the bigger picture of. So this is great for me, but I have a million questions, and one of them has to do with these splits that have come up in every presentation, starting with last night's, from Zev's, I don't know if it was half serious, half joking, he claims it's completely serious, but proposal to divide the state of Israel into two, one that would be a theocracy, one that would be a democracy. From that split between the Haredim and all the rest of us, that notion of who the Jews really are, to this morning's very interesting suggestion at the end of your presentation, Dan, yes, that in a sense we've got this split now between ethnicity and secularism. I mean, I don't think I've heard it put that way before, because out there in the general American Jewish community, the ordinary split that's thought of is between religious Jews and everybody else. But in fact, what you're doing this morning is very interesting, is you're turning around the notion of religion so that religion and secularism have more in common than your ersatz ethnic Jews have with either of them. And so I want to ask the following question. As someone who tries in her work to, in a sense, bridge the gap between secularism and religion, that is, as someone who tries to reclaim the language of religion, and specifically the language of Jewish religion, i.e. Hebrew, because I agree with, was it you who said it or the previous speaker, that language is a bottom line of ethnicity, I think, and I don't really see how, I give up everything else, I don't see how we'll have anything recognizable as Jewish without Hebrew, but that's another topic. But but as somebody who tries to use Hebrew to bridge that gap and to use the rubrics and the structure of the traditional liturgy, because the calendar is something that we all need to celebrate, whether secularists, ethnicists, or religious Jews. The calendar, the liturgical calendar, seems to be what we keep coming back to, the holidays, the Chagim. I mean, even the secular Zionists, Beit HaShita has a wonderful archive of all the different ways that the secular Zionists have celebrated the holidays in Israel. I mean, we're not inventing this here in...
If you use the word narrative, is it easier for you to combine them?
Wait a minute. Let me finish my point, because I think... yeah, let me ask my question, because I'll get distracted. I can't... You know, you pass a certain age and the short-term memory cells don't work, and you forget what you were saying at the beginning of the sentence. I'm more interested in your question. No, so what I was trying to say is, as somebody who's trying to bridge those gaps in a meaningful way, I mean, to really say what it is we believe in the context of a whole civilization and rubric, a civilization that has evolved precisely because it has interacted with surrounding cultures, and not because it has stayed insular. I think this is one of the false beliefs of sort of traditional Jews, you know, that you're destroying something when you don't hold on to this idealized past that never existed. As someone who tries to do that, why do I find resistance on all sides, i.e., not just from the so-called traditional Jews who think I'm a heretic, that I'm used to and can understand, but some of my feistiest opponents are the secular Jews in Israel who don't ever walk inside a Beit Knesset, don't even light candles on Friday night. But when I write a new bracha in Hebrew for lighting candles that will not require them to acknowledge any deity, they're horrified because I'm not leaving in place something they want to feel nostalgic about. I'm not leaving in place the synagogue that they never walk into. And so there was, I'm sorry. Okay.
I'll just respond in part to what you've said. Let me just clarify what I mean by secular, ethnic, and religious. By secular, I mean, when I say secular Jews, they are Jews who interpret, who experience their Jewishness in non-religious terms. They see themselves as Jews without regard to religion.
These are the ethnicists or the secularists?
But lacking a religious frame of reference, all they have to fall back on then is ethnicity. Now, in Jack's case, they have a lot to fall back on. In the case of the vast majority of American Jews, they have virtually nothing to fall back on. There is no ethnicity left of any significant substance. Yeah, bagels and lox.